fellow of SCT and now an honorary senior fellow. And it's my great pleasure this afternoon to introduce my colleague Tracy McNulty, professor of French and Comparative Literature at Cornell, but who's already known to many of you because she is one of the four seminar leaders this summer. So Tracy is a specialist in 20th century French literature, contemporary philosophy, and political theory, especially psychoanalytic theory. She received her BA in French from UC Berkeley and her PhD in comparative literature from UC Irvine. She regularly teaches interdisciplinary courses on such questions as the origins of language, myth and symbolic thought, eroticism and perversion, femininity, ethics, and aesthetics, philosophical, scientific, and psychoanalytics, theories of subjectivity and human agency, and the anthropological tradition in contemporary French thought, and sometimes even a bit of literature, too. Her first book, The Hostess, My Neighbor, Hospitality, and the Expropriation of Identity, was published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2007. This takes up the question of hospitality, which has figured very significantly in 20th century thought, even before it was an urgent political problem, shall we say, especially in the work of Derrida, Levinas, and Klossowski. She casting her net beyond the 20th century theory, going back to foundational biblical texts, for example. McNulty argues that every ethics is fundamentally an ethics of hospitality, and that hospitality is centrally entangled with questions of selfhood, autonomy, property, and the relation of self to others. And that these thinkers, 20th century thinkers, are right to think of the call to hospitality as fundamental to ethical life. What's particularly distinctive to her contribution is her claim that prior thinkers of hospitality have neglected the question of the feminine, specifically that of the hostess, whose role is central to the questions of hospitality and gives it a distinctive character. The hostess is an emblem of that very self-dispossession that is associated with hospitality itself. The hostess represents a division within the host, the presence of otherness within the figure of the host. Her shrewd and wide-ranging discussion, which moves from the Church Fathers to Nietzsche and Lacan, Nietzsche and Lacan's thinking of femininity, offers a novel contribution to this fundamental theoretical issue, which of course has become great practical relevance first in Europe, and today it's being sorely tested in America as well as in Europe. Her latest book, Wrestling with the Angel, Experiments in Symbolic Life, from Columbia, and on the University Press in 2014, focuses on the Lacanian conception of the symbolic order, but gives it a broader interpretation and stresses that it is much more than a site of the constraints of language and social norms. She emphasizes the frailty as well of the structuring force of the symbolic, which she argues is fundamentally historical, its elements emerging at particular times and places and subject to displacement, transformation, loss of efficacy. So once again, her project is squarely located within the tradition of contemporary French thought of the symbolic. Her examples are drawn from a very wide range of texts, eras, and practices. Texts, literary, religious, legal, and theoretical, from Moses to Jacques Rancière. The second part of the book focuses on debates about the symbolic functioning of the written law with Carl, more familiar cast of characters perhaps, Carl Schmitt, Badiou, St. Paul, and Benjamin as especially important references, but also Kant and Oulipo, unlikely couple, where the interaction between will and constraint is especially interesting. It's a very, very impressive interdisciplinary achievement. Tracy has also co-edited two special issues of journals, one Constructing the Desk Drive, that's an issue of Differences, and last in the spring of 2017, and Taking Exception to the Exception, a special issue of Diacritics with papers by Susan Buck-Morse, Jason Frank, Dominic Jones, Brian Koenig, Jeff Brett, herself, Andrew Norris, Sam Shapiro, and Freud. So it's Diacritics, spring 2008. She's the author of some 24 articles, of which the latest is Hysteria, forthcoming in the Bloomsbury Handbook of Literary and Cultural Theory. Currently, she reports that she is completing a book entitled Libertine Mathematics, Perversions of the Linguistic Turn, which juxtaposes masterpieces of the libertine tradition by the Marquis de Sade, Sacha Masoch, the Comte de Lautréamont, and Pauline Réag, each of which can be read as promoting the words a language of the real that will allow for an integral transmission of the drive, alongside contemporary theoretical works that have embraced the language of mathematical formalization, or other non-signifying languages. So either as an ultimate extension of, or a rejection or overturning of the so-called linguistic turn in 20th century thought. This features people like Deleuze, Badiou, and the speculative realists, and in a different way, a different sense, Jacques Derrida and Jacques Lacan. And the fourth book project, currently in progress, explores the intersubjectivity of political acts through the lens of psychoanalysis, to which I imagine this afternoon's lecture is related. So as your students this summer will doubtless have already discovered, Tracy is a serious intellectual who can always push students to a higher level of reflection and investigation. I have greatly enjoyed serving on graduate committees with her, because when I think, okay, this is pretty much okay, Tracy is always saying, well, she can when I'm inclined to just accept what the student has done, Tracy sees other possibilities that need to be developed and deficiencies that need to be remedied. More exciting, more complex possibilities for the future, and declines to take the path of least resistance. She's become central to the humanities here at Cornell, working tirelessly as a strong, sensible, and diplomatic administrator, working tirelessly to protect the humanities in our time of troubles here. This afternoon we'll encounter her, of course, as a scholar. Her title is Untreatable, the Freudian Act and its Legacy. So please welcome Tracy McNulty.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. You know that you're one of my very favorite colleagues, as you know, and have been not only an incredible source of mentorship and guidance for me here in my professional career, but I must say, part of the inspiration for what I'm going to say about the act. I think you will see what I mean. Can everyone hear okay? All right. So today's talk is related to a book project that I'm just beginning to think about, which is concerned with the problem of unconscious transmission. And it's related to the draft that I've circulated for Thursday's colloquium, which is concerned with the intersubjective dimension of political acts, or the way in which an act can be transmitted unconsciously from one individual or from one people to another. And when I've spoken to people about that work, I've realized that it's not at all obvious to other people what I mean when I speak about an act, right? If you've started reading that colloquium paper, I think you'll be struck by the same thing. So this is what I want to develop today, not in relation to politics this time, but in the context of the Freudian clinic. Lucy Quentin writes that from the moment when Freud first comes up against repetition and the resistance of the symptom in his clinical practice, he is forced to acknowledge a beyond of the pleasure principle that acts within the subject. Henceforth, the unconscious can no longer be conceived as a site of representations that are repressed because they are forbidden or inadmissible in the cultural or social sphere. In Remembering, Repeating, and Working Through from 1914, Freud realizes that repetition is in fact the enactment of what was unable to be represented. He writes that, quote, the patient does not remember anything of what he has forgotten and repressed, but acts it out. He reproduces it not as a memory, but as an action. He repeats it without, of course, knowing that he is repeating it. As a consequence, he adds, we must treat his illness not as an event of the past, but as a present-day force. In the framework of the transference, Freud continues, this still active force passes to the act, which explains the often unavoidable deterioration of symptoms during treatment. The analysis, therefore, becomes the place where what has been enacted, as a result of its failure to be represented, must find a way to be signified or spoken. In 1917, Freud states that the unconscious is, quote, the region of the memory traces of things as contrasted with word cathexes. The unconscious becomes the site of what has been inscribed precisely because it has never been represented in language, and therefore can only be repetitively staged or enacted. The result is a conception of the unconscious as the site where what remains outside of language, unrepresented, continues to work upon the body. It is this unconscious that interests the analysts, because it is the censored, the unnamed, that is the still active force at work in the life of the patient, pushing her to act without regard for the wishes of the ego and seeking a path for itself through the symptom or acting out, no matter what the consequences for the organism or the ego in the social link. Given this description, it's not surprising that we generally think of the act as something bad, a symptom, an impasse, something that may even be violent or destructive to others, as in the passage à l'acte. And yet psychoanalysis is not about controlling what is acting or getting it to stop. It doesn't aim at an ideal of self-control or the mastery of the unconscious by the ego. Instead, it is concerned with freeing what is acting, allowing it to find another means of expression. One interesting consequence is that the act of desire, whose liberation is the aim of an analysis, is not unrelated to the symptom, to which it might logically seem to be opposed. This proximity, which may seem paradoxical, is part of what I want to explore today. Jacques Lacan, in his seminar on the analytic act, suggests that the patient's act is not something the analyst can know, interpret, or anticipate, but something by which he is struck, both psychically and in his body, where it leaves its traces or impressions. The act leaves effects in the real. It acts upon a body and not upon the understanding alone. What strikes the analyst in the act, as distinct from the acting out that often characterizes the analysand's way of relating to the analyst, for example, as an object of love or aggression, is what Lacan calls the objet A, the object cause of desire that acts in and through the subject. Like a black hole, which cannot be perceived directly but is known only by the way that it warps space-time, the object of psychoanalysis is an object we know solely by its effects. Because the object cause of desire is a purely mental object that does not, properly speaking, exist, it cannot be perceived, sensed, or known empirically. Instead, it must create a path for itself in the world through the subject's act. I'll begin today by exploring the status of the object in relation to the procedure of the pass, which Lacan introduced in 1967 at a time when he was preoccupied by the relationship between psychoanalysis and science. While he recognized the need for some means of communicating and confirming the results of an analysis, Lacan acknowledged that neither the analyst who directs the cure nor any third-party observer could produce epistemologically rigorous results. The procedure of the pass responds to this problem. In the pass, the analysand testifies to her own experience and attempts to transmit something of her relation to the object that causes desire. But while this testimony might bear a superficial resemblance to the genre of the case presentation, which attempts to produce a logical construction accounting for the fantasy at work in the subject's life, it is also fundamentally different. For unlike a case history, which concerns a third party who is not present, the testimony of the pass is delivered by the subject herself, and thus by the very body with which that testimony is concerned. The pass, as I've helpfully diagrammed for you, involves the passant, the candidate who addresses his request to the school, and two passeurs, or witnesses, to whom the passant speaks about his analysis. They are in turn responsible for transmitting that testimony to a jury of analysts who meet as a cartel and formulate a response, either nomination of the passant as an analyst of the school or no nomination. Yet the pass is concerned not primarily with what the passant has managed to say about her analysis, but with something that exceeds the signifier and that therefore passes through the body. This real object, transmitted by an act of the unconscious, is what Lacan calls the objet A. It is not an object of conscious observation or recording, but something that is at once transmitted by a body and received by a body, depositing itself in the bodies of the two passeurs without their knowledge. Here, the dimension of science is not a matter of what can be demonstrated logically or verified by a third party under controlled conditions. If there is something scientific about the pass, it is not its possible generalization or elucidation of a law. Rather, it is something that is actually not so far removed from the classic standard of falsifiability. The same object must be transmitted by both passeurs. So based on what I've just said, I see Hens sighing in a way that I'm sure everyone can identify with. Based on what I've just said, you won't be surprised to learn that the procedure of the past is the object of considerable suspicion, if not outright derision, among non-Lacanians. Right? This is really the secret handshake side of psychoanalysis that I think everyone has suspected is there and is in fact central to the whole thing. But in what follows, I hope to give a sense of why we should take that seriously. I recently served as a passeur in such a procedure. Right? That is, not as the person giving testimony, but as one of the two people who received or witnessed that testimony. Based on everything I knew about the past, my expectations were high. But as I listened to the passant speak about key episodes from her childhood, the repetitions that had marked her life, and the vicissitudes of her analysis, I began to feel increasingly preoccupied, even distracted, by the feeling that the analysis was not complete, that something still needed to be articulated or worked through. A sensation of impatience, even irritation, began to overtake me as each of the 4 sessions came and went. There was too much filler, too few key signifiers and experiences, and as a result, I began to feel a little oppressed, even annoyed. There was a gap of 6 months between the hearing of the testimony and my transmission of that testimony to the Cartel of the past. When the Cartel received me, I was asked a single question: what remains? Not surprisingly, my memory of those 4 hours of testimony was foggy at best. I recalled a number of stories involving the passant and her social and professional life and personal relationships, some childhood memories and experiences, a few dreams and symptoms, some important choices or acts. I was also left with a specific image described at some length by the passant that clearly came in the place of something that couldn't be said. When I had more or less run out of things to say, I admitted to feeling disappointed that I didn't have more to transmit, that the logic of the analysis and the subject's traversal of its different logical phases was not more in evidence. While giving my testimony, there were several occasions on which I leaned forward in my chair, my body almost parallel to the ground, and put my head in my hands, thus. Okay? An attitude that felt very foreign to me, but which I nevertheless felt strangely compelled to adopt. It wasn't something I thought about during the testimony, but only afterwards. Leaving the room, I was aware of having assumed this attitude at least 3 separate times during the testimony, and I wondered what it might mean, whether I was straining to recall some detail that had escaped me, or simply turning away from the eyes that were fixed on me while I spoke. A few days after giving my testimony, I had the occasion to talk with the other person who had served as passeur for the same individual. So part of this, which I'm not explaining, is the idea you're never allowed to talk with the other person beforehand, during the experience, or even afterward, until after having given testimony to the Cartel. He told me that in the days leading up to his meeting with the Cartel, he had been afflicted with extreme dizziness and disorientation, and had arrived to meet the Cartel with a terrible headache. Only as he was walking into the room to give his testimony did it occur to him that this head trouble must be precisely the object he was carrying. As he was speaking, I suddenly remembered that I, too, had had a terrible headache that evening, not before giving the testimony, as he had, but immediately afterward. I now recalled that how I had taken my head in my hands during the testimony and felt certain that something more had been acting in me without my knowledge, compelling me to adopt this strange attitude. While I was giving my testimony to the Cartel, the thought had in fact briefly passed through my mind that I ought to say something about what Lacan calls the letters of the body, the places where the traces of the subject's encounter with the real had been inscribed in her body. I had been vaguely aware that this had something to do with the head, but I couldn't remember the passant's exact words. I therefore allowed the thought to come and go in silence, almost without being conscious of it. Somatic symptoms had not played a major role in the life of this individual, but she had described at one point an unsettling experience, a moment of acute dissociation where she found herself in a large social gathering with people she clearly knew, but was suddenly unable to remember who she was. I had touched on this experience briefly during my testimony, describing it as a moment of extreme disorientation and loss of reference points. I now remembered that the passant had related this experience to the head by means of a formulation peculiar to her. She had also spoken about a certain personality trait colloquially related to the head, which she had long viewed as a source of anxiety and dread, something that not only interfered with the fulfillment of her professional duties, but potentially disqualified her altogether from the work that she does. In short, she had always viewed it as a trait to be kept under wraps that she had hoped eventually to be cured of. It was this disturbing trait, in fact, that had led her to undertake analysis in the first place. In recent years, however, she testified to having made her peace with this trait and accepting the way that it acted in her, even if she couldn't exactly be thrilled about it. It now seemed to me that in putting my head in my hands, I was evoking through my body what was not spoken, something of the subject's own relation to the head, or rather to the object that managed to find expression through it. Inasmuch as it related to a part of her testimony that I hadn't fully developed, it seemed on one level to be reminding me of something important I had failed to convey. So recall that I was afflicted with a headache that, after giving the testimony, as if to stress that I hadn't yet made my deposit, as it were. At the same time, my head holding, and especially my violent headache, attested to something more having been deposited in my head, something weighing it down that was much more than just a memory. I take this something to be a part of the subject's experience that remained unsayable, something whose meaning could not be fully known, that resisted mastery, and that therefore acted in her in a way that she couldn't control. Another symptom occurred to me a week or two later. In the 6 months between hearing the Passant's testimony and coming before the Cartel, I had experienced a sudden spike in blood sugar, serious enough to undergo treatment for diabetes. I'm a hysteric, in case that isn't already obvious. The most conspicuous symptom of a blood sugar imbalance is a feeling of dizziness and mental confusion. It now seemed plausible to me that this transitory symptom, which attested to the malfunctioning or even the failure of a regulatory apparatus, not incidentally an apparatus controlling insulin, and thus the body's defense against something indigestible, was itself due to the effects of the Passant's testimony on my body. The impatience and even the irritation with which I listened to her words had to do precisely with the feeling that there was something she was not managing to say, something for which there was as yet no signifier. I believe that this mental confusion or head trouble can be interpreted in at least two different ways. Inasmuch as it conveys the oppressive feeling of being confronted with something that is insufficiently ordered or articulated, it might be understood as a resistance to the inadequacy of language, its inability to name what is at stake in the subject's experience. From another perspective, though, it can actually be considered as a transmission of the object, which is not supported by speech. This is how I'm inclined to read my own gesture of holding my head in my hands while giving testimony, as evidence that something more has been deposited in my head than I am able to say, something that weighs me down in a way that words alone are unable to prop up or sustain. What was unable to find its signifier passed through the letters of the body, taking up residence in my head. The undesirable trait that the Passant had linked to the head is clearly a symptom in her life, even a debilitating symptom. Nevertheless, it also gives expression to something more fundamental that she is no longer inclined to apologize for, that she no longer sees as a trait she should work on or try to manage. I think this is the meaning of the dizziness, headaches, and crashing blood sugar with which the other passeur and I were afflicted prior to giving testimony. There is a kind of storm in the head that is not at all controllable, that is even, I have to say, extremely unpleasant, but that is obviously tied to who the Passant is as a subject. She is aware that this object is acting within her in a way that she doesn't control, but she no longer fears that action or tries to make it stop. In fact, she's now certain that it is inseparable from the efficacy of her work, in this case, her ability to work with patients as a clinician. A first hypothesis about the objet is that unlike the symptom to which it is otherwise closely related, the object is untreatable. I take the term from Willie Apollon, for whom the untreatable is the name for what is most fundamental to the subject, the manifestation of an unconscious quest from which it will not be derailed. It exceeds the treatment framework implied by illness, which presumes at the same time the possibility of a cure. Untreatable translates to the French intraitable, which means not incurable, as in the case of a disease for which there is no cure, but rather intractable, inflexible, uncompromising. It is this untreatable object that Lucy Quentin has in mind when she suggests that the conclusion of the analytic experience articulates the passant to what constitutes his or her signature in the social link, the mark of the subject in its refusal of all concessions. We've seen that the procedure of the pass is concerned with the transmission of an object between bodies, or the capacity of the object in one body to produce effects in another. In the next part of this talk, I want to track this object in the act of one singular body, the body of Sigmund Freud. This act is central to the analysis of the specimen dream with which Freud opens the interpretation of dreams, the dream of Irma's injection. It shows that this untreatable object is what acts in the analyst and that there can be no psychoanalysis without it. It is commonplace to observe that this dream is about the origins of psychoanalysis itself, but in what precise sense? Here I would like to propose that the analysis of this dream can be considered as Freud's pass, his transmission of his own object. It is concerned with the liberation of his act, which previously had been an object of ambivalence and even apprehension. The dream interrogates a failed act or ethical equivocation on Freud's part, which is related to the treatment of his hysterical patient, Irma. Freud explains that in the months leading up to the dream, I had been giving psychoanalytic treatment to a young lady which had ended in partial success. The patient was relieved of her hysterical anxiety, but did not lose all of her somatic symptoms. At that time, I was not yet quite clear in my mind as to the criteria indicating that a hysterical case history was finally closed, and I proposed a solution to the patient, which she seemed unwilling to accept. While we were thus at variance, we had broken off the treatment for the summer vacation. One day, I had a visit from a junior colleague who had been staying with my patient, Irma, and her family at their country resort. I asked him how he had found her, and he answered, "She's better, but not quite well." I was conscious that my friend Otto's words, or the tone in which he spoke them, annoyed me. I fancied I detected a reproof in them to the effect that I had promised the patient too much. However, my disagreeable impression was not clear to me, and I gave no outward sign of it. The same evening, I wrote out Irma's case history with the idea of giving it to Dr. M to justify myself. That very night, Freud has the following dream. A large hall, numerous guests whom we were receiving. Among them was Irma. I at once took her on one side as though to answer her letter and to reproach her for not having accepted my solution yet. I said to her, "If you still get pains, it's really only your fault." She replied, "If you only knew what pains I've got now in my throat and stomach and abdomen, it's choking me." I was alarmed and looked at her. She looked pale and puffy. I thought to myself that after all, I must be missing some organic trouble. I took her to the window and looked down her throat, and she showed signs of recalcitrance, like women with artificial dentures. I thought to myself that there was really no need for her to do that. She then opened her mouth properly, and on the right I found a big white patch, and another place I saw extensive whitish-gray scabs upon some remarkable curly structures, which were evidently modeled on the terminal bones of the nose. I at once called in Dr. M, and he repeated the examination and confirmed it. Dr. M looked quite different from usual. He was very pale, he walked with a limp, and his chin was clean-shaven. My friend Otto was now standing beside her as well, and my friend Leopold was percussing her through her bodice and saying, "She has a dull area low down on the left." He also indicated that a portion of the skin on the left shoulder was infiltrated. I noticed this just as he did, in spite of her dress. M said, "There's no doubt it's an infection, but no matter, dysentery will supervene and the toxin will be eliminated." We were directly aware, too, of the origin of her infection. Not long before, when she was feeling unwell, my friend Otto had given her an injection of a preparation of propyl, propyls, propionic acid, trimethylamine. And I saw before me the formula for this printed in heavy type. Injections of that sort ought not to be made so thoughtlessly, and probably the syringe had not been clean. Driving the production of Freud's dream is thus the question, is he or is he not responsible for the persistence of the patient's symptoms? If it is a hysterical symptom, then why hasn't it been treated by the interpretation? Has he missed an organic illness? What is the source of the infection? The first part of the dream is concerned with Freud's vexation at Irma's refusal to accept his solution and his attempts to get the hysteric to open her mouth properly and tell him what he needs to know. The dream dates from July of 1895, when Freud is involved precisely in getting the hysteric to open her mouth. This is the year that Freud and Bauer published their studies on hysteria, in which Freud hypothesizes that the symptom is caused by an unspoken secret, something the patient doesn't want to say or cannot face up to. From this perspective, resistance is a matter of the patient not wanting to express the thoughts that are in her mind, refusing to open her mouth and tell us what she knows. The corollary of this attitude is a belief in the treatment of the symptom by knowledge or interpretation. In the first part of the dream, Freud says to Irma, "If you still get pains, it's your own fault." In his analysis, Freud writes, "It was my view at the time, though I have since recognized it as a wrong one, that my task was fulfilled when I had informed a patient of the hidden meaning of his symptoms. I considered that I was not responsible for whether he accepted the solution or not." This is what Freud will later refer to as wild psychoanalysis, the assumption that knowledge, the signifier, can treat the symptom, that once the cause of the symptom is revealed, the symptom should disappear. At the time Freud is writing this dream analysis, he has already decided that his earlier view was not correct. But at the time he had the dream, he believed it was. And in fact, one of the things I'm interested in thinking about is whether this dream and its interpretation actually marks the transition from one view to the other. Right? At this period, Freud is discovering for the first time that the patient is confronted with a real for which there is no name, about which she knows nothing, that is not an object of conscious knowledge. The assumption that the hysteric is to blame for the persistence of her symptoms is thus the failed act that gave rise to the dream, which was reactivated by Otto's news concerning Irma. The dream pinpoints what can only be described as an instance of countertransference on Freud's part, in the form of a refusal of what comes from the unconscious. This part of the dream identifies a hole, a lack, something that escapes knowledge. What follows is the famous navel of the dream, which confronts Freud with an unspeakable real that the signifier is unable to represent. When Irma opens her mouth properly, what emerges is not a word or a discourse, something she might tell him, but terrifying, anxiety-inducing forms that lead to anguishing thoughts of illness and death. In Irma's throat, Freud sees a big white patch and some remarkable curly structures covered with extensive whitish-gray scabs that appear to be modeled on the terminal bones of the nose. Unlike everything else in the dream, this element can't be related to recent events that have unfolded in reality, that is, in the reality of the social or professional scene. These scab-covered forms lead Freud to associations that are concerned not with Irma's symptoms and their treatment, but with Freud's own severe nasal symptoms, the result, in fact, of his overly zealous experimentation with cocaine. His own symptom is thus projected into the patient's throat as a defiant limit to the knowable, there where he had expected the words that would establish the symptom's causality. The associations extend to further failed acts on Freud's part in the form of grave mistakes and errors of judgment in his clinical practice. A few days before the dream, he learned that a woman patient who had used cocaine at his urging had developed an extensive necrosis of the nasal membrane, while a dear friend to whom Freud had recommended the same drug died from an overdose after injecting it against his instructions. On another occasion, Freud produced a fatal toxic state by repeatedly prescribing what at the time was regarded as a harmless remedy. It seemed, Freud writes, as if I had been collecting all the occasions which I could bring up against myself as evidence of a lack of medical conscientiousness. The second part of the dream shows Freud turning to medical colleagues for confirmation or guidance, as if unsure whether he ought to approach the case as a doctor or as a psychoanalyst. Dr. M, a senior colleague to whom Freud regularly turns for advice, is represented as saying, "There's no doubt it's an infection, but no matter, dysentery will supervene and the toxin will be eliminated." The associations lead to cases in which a patient's symptoms were misdiagnosed by doctors ignorant of hysteria. But they also call up occasions when Freud recognized that a patient's symptoms were hysterical, but nevertheless decided not to apply psychoanalytic treatment, much to the detriment of the patient. Both evoke the futile hope of the medical doctor that it might be possible to eliminate the toxin after all, to treat hysteria as if it were a disease. Here we see Freud hesitating between medicine and psychoanalysis, but also between the scientific ideal of the community of peers, where others can validate and confirm what he sees, and his own fundamental solitude. The scientific ideal is predicated upon observation, verification, and repeatability. The night before he had the dream, Freud tells us that he sat up late into the night writing Irma's case history, which he intended to show to Dr. M in order to justify myself. In the dream narrative, we find the words, "Dr. M repeated the examination and confirmed it," right? So the dream in the sense sort of fulfilling this wish, right, to receive confirmation from others. Against this, the inadequacy of medical knowledge that is exposed by the associations emphasizes the total isolation in which Freud finds himself as the inventor of psychoanalysis. The cause of the hysteric symptoms cannot be isolated, observed, or verified experimentally under controlled conditions. Despite Freud's efforts the night before to justify himself before Dr. M, the associations show that his senior colleague is not in agreement with his solution. Like the other doctors, he is taken in by hysteria and misdiagnoses his own hysterical patient. Freud is thus faced by the failure of medical knowledge with respect to the real at work in the symptom. Freud's analysis concludes with a final series of associations that are concerned with the source of Irma's infection, and by extension with symptoms and their causality. The dream narrative ends with the evocation of an unclean syringe charged with having caused an infection in the patient. Injections of that sort ought not to be made so thoughtlessly, and probably the syringe had not been clean. In response to this dream element, Freud professes that unlike some of his more careless colleagues, he always makes sure that his syringe is clean. As a result, he has never caused a single infiltration. His associations have already undercut this claim, however, by pointing to numerous occasions on which Freud has either killed his patients with injections or induced potentially deadly toxic states, in part by sharing his own passion for cocaine. On the one hand, it's significant that Freud harmed or killed those patients when he was acting as a doctor and not as a psychoanalyst. In these instances, we can say that the patient's brush with death is due to the limitations of medical knowledge rather than to the failings of psychoanalysis. But on the other, and more importantly, Freud, as a psychoanalyst, is confronting his patients with death by upholding the work of the symptom. In psychoanalysis, unlike medicine, this isn't just a matter of professional scrupulousness, of a risk that could be avoided through a careful attention to protocol. Instead, the treatment confronts his patients with death at its very core. I see the dirty syringe as a figure of the act in two senses. First, it figures the failed act or countertransference. In the associations to the first part of the dream, Freud reproaches Irma for not accepting his solution and tells her that if she still gets pains, it's her fault. Here we see him trying to treat with words, with a formulation or diagnosis, a real that cannot be treated by the signifier. In an instance of wild psychoanalysis, Freud imposes on the patient the solution provided by the interpretation, but at the expense of silencing what is actually at work in the symptom. The German word translated as solution, Lösung, has two possible meanings, just as it does in English: the solution to a problem and the solution one injects. It thus relates to the failed act that gave rise to the dream, Freud's refusal of what is at work in the hysteric symptom, whose persistence he attributes to a lack of ethics on the part of his patient. With the image of the unclean syringe, the dream seems to be offering a forceful indictment of this countertransference on Freud's part, his attempt to force or inject a solution rather than allowing the analysis to run its course. Lacan makes such an interpretation in his own commentary of the dream. Quote, "In the first phase, then, we see Freud in his chase after Irma, reproaching her for not understanding what he wants to get her to understand. He was carrying on his relationships in exactly the same style as he did in real life, in the style of the passionate quest. Too passionate, we would say. And it is indeed one of the meanings of the dream to say that formally, since at the end that is what it comes down to, the syringe was dirty. The passion of the analyst, the ambition to succeed, were here too pressing. The countertransference was itself the obstacle." But second, and here I differ from Lacan, I think we can see the dirty syringe as a figure of the true act, the act of desire that makes him Freud, and thus the very act at stake in the procedure of the pass. That is, the analyst's desire to know triggers and reactivates the symptom in the patient's body, and it can't do otherwise. From this perspective, we can see the dirty syringe in a more affirmative light as essential to the practice of analysis. In contrast with the inadvertently deadly act of the doctor providing lethal treatment, the analyst's act necessarily confronts the human subject with death. In professing that his syringe was always clean, Freud seems to be disclaiming his own act, and with it his role in triggering the patient's symptoms. The fear that the syringe might not be clean is the fear of the medical doctor, however. It corresponds to the ideal of experiments under controlled conditions, where there must be no contamination from the subject. For the doctor, the dirty syringe is a failure and a breach of scientific protocol. For the psychoanalyst, it is a necessity. The psychoanalyst must infect. He must provoke symptoms in the patient's body, reactivating a real that she will have a hard time managing. So I hope you can hear sort of an echo between this infection and what happens in my experience of the past. Right? The passant deposited something in our heads, right? Injected her object into us and left us, in a sense, to deal with the consequences. Rather than conscientiously sterilizing his person in order to avoid transmitting something, the analyst acts with the object cause of his own desire, thereby eliciting the work of the drive in the analysand. With the signifier of the dirty syringe, therefore, the dream simultaneously indicts a failed act on Freud's part and offers a figuration of the act that found psychoanalysis. If the doctors in the dream wonder how to eliminate the toxin, the answer of psychoanalysis is that the toxin cannot be eliminated because it is inseparable from the subject. If the medical doctors are concerned with the possibility of treating or relieving the symptom, the psychoanalyst is concerned with the untreatable. Willie Apollon says that in the symptom, the unconscious is struggling against something that is good for the individual. Why? Because the unconscious wants to go further. It wants to go beyond the pleasure principle. The analyst is the ally of the symptom. He isn't trying to relieve it or control it, but to support the quest of the unconscious, a quest that necessarily leads the subject beyond the pleasure principle. This dimension of going too far is key and might even be considered the hallmark of the subject's act. That is why it's essential that, far from corresponding to an ideal, the object is something that is manifestly unacceptable, both to the subject and to others. In Freud's case, it is not unrelated to the deaths he has caused. So what I love about this dream is that it also lays bare what is somewhat embarrassing about Freud, even for his disciples, namely the fact that Freud himself is led beyond the pleasure principle by his quest. He pushes his patients too hard, he kills people, he snorts cocaine, he smokes like a true addict his whole life, a fact that no doubt contributed to the cancer from which he died. We might be tempted to see these as features of Freud's personality that show that he hasn't been completely analyzed, that he is still under the sway of the symptom or of self-destructive behavior. Apollon observes that every analysand is sooner or later confronted with the disquieting realization that, quote, the object of his quest is at the same time the object of all of his misfortunes. He can neither rid himself of it nor require that it be healed unless it is by the negation of his very existence as a subject, unquote. Earlier I claimed that the dream analysis could be understood as Freud's pass, not so much because he manages to construct and put into words an unconscious logic, but because he emerges from the dream analysis having accepted what is acting in him, as well as in his patients, rather than fearing or repudiating it. When Freud, the dreamer, peers into Irma's throat to find his own symptoms staring back at him, what he encounters is not only his own relation to the untreatable, but more powerfully the agency of his own object within the body of his patient. After the turning point marked by this dream and its analysis, Freud doesn't hesitate to inject his patients with his dirty syringe, to re-trigger the symptom or call forth the drive. It is thus the bodies of these patients that attest to the object that acts in Freud. If the object figured by this dirty syringe is Freud's signature in the social link, it is also closely related to what inspires resistance and even contempt in many readers of his work. In the final section of this talk, I would like to suggest that the transmission of such an object, as well as its repression or refusal, is precisely what Freud explores in Moses and Monotheism. How, he asks of Moses, did one single man come to stamp his people with its definite character and determine its fate for millennia to come? Stamp implies a corporeal impression, a body that receives an imprint, a mark, or a blow. What then is involved in being stamped by the act, and how might it shed light on the stakes of the act for those who receive it? Freud shows the Mosaic transmission to have two components: the doctrine of monotheism inherited from the pharaoh Akhenaten, but also the object of the man Moses, right, this being the German title of the work, that finds expression in this project or that seeks to impose it, but is not reducible to that project itself. The passion of Moses, his fire. The theophany of the burning bush could be understood as the legendary figuration of what is at stake in the second transmission. Moses has an encounter with the real that is inscribed on his body in the form of a radiance that emanates from his face, which is at once a scar or a wound and a sign of election, the mark of the fire that burns but does not consume. This radiance sets him apart from others. and makes his unveiled face unbearable to behold, just like God's. Lacan, glossing the episode, declares the burning bush to be Moses' thing and leaves it at that. Freud, of course, disdains the more supernatural elements of the biblical story and passes over the miraculous fire in silence. But I believe this legendary episode nevertheless figures something that is essential to his reading, namely his attempt to track a transmission that exceeds the symbolic legacy of the Mosaic Law. Something is transmitted symbolically in language, the Ten Commandments, the monotheist religion, and so forth, while something else is transmitted in the real, right, by means of the body or the act. Where then do we see the traces of the second transmission? Moses is famously depicted in the Bible as slow of speech, which is generally taken to mean that he stammers. "O my Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor even now that you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." I take this as a representation of the subject of the act as something other than a subject of discourse, someone who makes an argument or articulates a position. His power is not a rhetorical power. That is the role of the priests, the professional interpreters, and the builders of party platforms. Strikingly, then, there is no direct communication between Moses and those who will be stamped by his act, the Israelites who are the ultimate depositories of his transmission. Instead, his speech is relayed by an intermediary, his brother Aaron, in a very past-like transmission. When Moses asks him to send someone else, God says, "What of your brother Aaron, the Levite? I know that he can speak fluently. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you what you shall do. He indeed shall speak for you to the people. He shall serve as a mouth for you, and you shall serve as God for him." Moses does not merely speak through Aaron, however, but acts through his body, which is charged with actually carrying out the actions attributed to Moses. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "When Pharaoh says to you, 'Perform a wonder,' then you shall say to Aaron, 'Take your staff and throw it down before Pharaoh, and it will become a snake.'" Aaron transmits something of the act of Moses, that part that becomes the basis of the legendary history. He founds the priesthood, which transmits the ethical program of Moses, the symbolic dimension of his legacy, that part that manages to find its signifier. The function of the priest is to create a symbolic structure charged with assuring and enshrining this transmission, and at the same time to repress whatever cannot be transmitted in this manner. One of its most important consequences in religious history is the gradual disappearance of the real dimensions of the God of Moses in favor of a God who is the Word, who gradually becomes collapsed with speech itself, a process that ultimately culminates in the kind of formulation that we find in the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Here we are dealing with an other who is purely symbolic, and thus with the victory of repression, inasmuch as it entails the subordination of the real to the signifier. Aaron is the one who puts everything into words, who is eloquent of speech, but perhaps a little too eloquent. For while he transmits something of Moses' act, we might also understand him as blocking or refusing a part of what Moses transmitted in this very act of translation. In this sense, he might offer an analogy for the passeur who is not up to the task. He is still too much implicated in the imaginary, of meaning, of the social relation, the demands others make on him, and even of his relation to the other. Not surprisingly, then, it is Aaron himself who forges the golden calf at the demand of the Israelites, while Moses is still on the mountain. This particular transmission of Moses' act and the stamp it left on his people is therefore inseparable from its violent repression and repudiation. Aaron's founding of the priesthood could in this sense be related to the institutional history of psychoanalysis, which is always at risk of becoming nothing more than a priesthood or a church, one that receives the laws of Freud's transmission, but not the object that drives him. In the same way, the monotheist doctrine is preserved by the Israelite priests as a program, a set of principles that remained more or less intact. What is not transmitted by that tradition is the role of Moses himself, the subject of the act. Where then do we find the traces of that transmission? I believe this is what Freud has in mind when he claims to recognize the traits of the subject, of the man Moses, in the anger and irascibility that are attributed to him. The biblical story itself lends Moses certain features in which one is inclined to believe. It describes him as choleric, hot-tempered, as when, in his indignation, he kills the brutal overseer who ill-treated a Jewish workman, or when, in his resentment at the defection of his people, he smashes the tables he has been given on Mount Sinai. Indeed, God himself punished him at long last for a deed of impatience. We are not told what it was. Since such a trait does not lend itself to glorification, it may very well be historical truth. Nor can we reject even the possibility that many character traits the Jews incorporated into their early conception of God when they made him jealous, stern, and implacable were taken essentially from their memory of Moses. For in truth, it was not an invisible God, but the man Moses who had led them out of Egypt. Because anger is a trait that doesn't lend itself to idealization, we can assume that it is a trait of the subject and not the hero of legend. I think Freud's point is not just that anger is a human trait, one that shows Moses to be a man and not a myth, but that anger is what I'm calling the object of Moses, his signature in the social link. What compels him to initiate the Exodus and to found a new religion, but more fundamentally, what drives him as a subject. The treatment of this anger is central to Freud's reconstruction of the historical compromise whose traces he finds in the text of the Bible, in which the monotheist doctrine bestowed on the Israelites by the Egyptian Moses has been merged with an earlier cult dedicated to a fearsome volcano god. More specifically, anger is the trait by which Freud claims to distinguish the Egyptian Moses, the real Moses, from the Midianite priest of the same name, who he finds to be singularly lacking in the qualities needed for such a grand undertaking. Since the Moses people attached such great importance to their experience of the Exodus from Egypt, the deed of freeing them had to be ascribed to Yahweh. It had to be adorned with features that prove the terrific grandeur of this volcano god, such as, for example, the pillar of smoke, which changed to one of fire by night, or the storm that parted the waters, so that the pursuers were drowned by the returning floods of water. The Exodus and the founding of the new religion were thus brought close together in time, the long interval between them being denied. The bestowal of the Ten Commandments, too, was said to have taken place not at Kadesh, but at the foot of the holy mountain amid the signs of a volcanic eruption. By this means, a balance, so to speak, was established. Yahweh was able to extend his reach to Egypt from his mountain in Midian, while the existence and activity of Moses were transferred to Kadesh and the country east of the Jordan. This is how he became one with the person who later established a religion, the son-in-law of the Midianite Jethro, the man to whom he lent his name, Moses. We know nothing personal, however, about this other Moses. He is entirely obscured by the first, the Egyptian Moses, except possibly from clues provided by the contradictions to be found in the Bible and in the characterization of Moses. He is often enough described as masterful, hot-tempered, even violent, and yet it is also said of him that he was the most patient and meek of all men. It is clear that the latter qualities would have been of no use to the Egyptian Moses, who planned such great and difficult projects for his people. Perhaps they belong to the other, the Midianite. Anger and irascibility are not merely character traits or capacities, therefore, but the signature of the subject. Subsequent generations will attribute these traits to God himself, ascribing them to this other whose act transforms the world. It would be interesting to consider whether the two Moses figures of Freud's reconstruction are not so much two distinct historical actors, the Egyptian and the Midianite, but rather representations of two different dimensions of the subject's act, what might be called symbolic and real. The part that can be assimilated to social or religious ideals, and the part that fails to find any such representation, but that nevertheless strikes or stamps its recipient. The act of the angry Moses is the one the tradition is ultimately unable to absorb, and must repress first through its deification and displacement, and second through its repudiation and censorship. This is how Freud reads the biblical account of Moses angrily breaking the tables of the law, when he descends from the mountain to see his rebellious people worshiping the idol they have created in his absence. So apologies for inflicting upon you this bad sort of Vatican II depiction of this moment. It's interesting that the better artists sort of steer away from this particular depiction of Moses. This anger is directed first against the Israelites, who in their idolatry have shown themselves to be unworthy of the covenant with this invisible God. But inasmuch as the first object of his destructive wrath is not the golden calf, but the tablets of the law themselves, it is hard not to read that anger as an indictment not merely of idols and idol worship, but of the inadequacy of those words themselves. or the way in which the object cause of desire exceeds and overwhelms the framework of the signifier or law. This extra-legal or even illegal dimension of Moses' act is precisely what the Israelites will repudiate and suppress. In Freud's reading, the destruction of the tablets cannot be attributed to the man Moses and his real legacy. Instead, he reads the biblical text as more or less akin to a dream, a text that offers only a distorted representation of a reality that it serves above all to repress. In this case, the people's condemnation of Moses and criminalization of his act. For Freud, the smashing of the tables of the law must be understood symbolically. He has broken the law. Moses himself is made guilty of the crime. If anger and irascibility convey the inevitable violence of the act, its way of forcing into the world something that is without precedent, then the illegality of the act is one way of depicting this. The true actor is always a lawbreaker. This criminalization of the act is what leads the Israelites eventually to repeat the primal murder on the person of Moses himself, in what Freud calls a case of acting instead of remembering. The biblical narrative further distorts and effaces this event by having God punish Moses for an act of infidelity in a way that I think reveals very well the tension between the signifier and the act. The book of Numbers recounts that Moses was not permitted to enter the promised land with the Israelites because of a display of impatience that occurred at Meribah in the last year of the desert pilgrimage, when Moses brought water out of a rock to quench the people's thirst. This is a depiction of that scene in a 2nd century tomb drawing. Although God had commanded Moses to speak to the rock, he instead struck it twice with his staff, which was construed as displaying a lack of deference to the Lord. I want to highlight here the opposition between speaking and striking. If the first expresses a kind of fidelity to the signifier, the second is an act that can be understood both as an indictment of and as a compensation for the failings of the signifier. While this deed of impatience, this sin, is a defiance of the word of God, it is also at the same time a true act. Right? In other words, it's not just a matter of tell me what to do and I will faithfully do it. Right? Because of this rebellion, Moses is not allowed to enter the Holy Land. After he dies, he will be buried without a sepulcher in a place without a place. There is no signifier, no symbolic locus for the subject of the act, whose place will be effaced from Jewish history. It's crucial for Freud's reading that the repressed is not something that can be found in a text or even in an archaeological artifact or an oral tradition. It can be identified only by the traces it leaves in the bodies of those it stamps, traces that Freud ultimately locates in the Apostle Paul. Paul retains in his unconscious what entire generations have managed to repress, the truth of the primal murder and its repetition on the person of Moses. It would be interesting to consider whether Paul is the passeur in whose body, more than in his testimony, Freud finds the traces of the act or the object of Moses, not in its symbolic dimension, right, what we see transmitted by Aaron, or even in its repudiation, the Hebrews' reversion to polytheism, Christian anti-Semitism, and so forth, but in its extra-legal or real dimension. For Freud, Paul is important because he raises the repression surrounding the primal murder, which was repeated on Moses. It seems that a growing feeling of guiltiness had seized the Jewish people as a precursor of the return of the repressed material. Paul, a Roman Jew from Tarsus, seized upon this feeling of guilt and correctly traced it back to its primeval source. This he later called original sin. It was a crime against God that could be expiated only through death. Death had come into the world through original sin. In reality, this crime, deserving of death, had been the murder of the Father, who later was deified. The murderous deed itself, however, was not remembered. In its place stood the fantasy of expiation, and that is why this fantasy could be welcomed in the form of a gospel of salvation. A son of God, innocent himself, had sacrificed himself and had thereby taken over the guilt of the world. It had to be a son, for the sin had been murder of the Father. The essence of this gospel seems to have been Paul's own contribution. He was a man with a gift for religion in the truest sense of the phrase. Dark traces of the past lay in his soul, ready to break through into the regions of consciousness. But how exactly should we understand this thesis, which Freud puts forward without any development? I've been thinking about this for maybe 20 years. How exactly does Paul transmit what was repressed, and how does that transmission differ from what I've called the symbolic transmission, including those distortions and transpositions that allow a certain repressed to be reconstructed? So, I mean, in other words, in a certain way, we don't necessarily need Paul to come along for a certain amount of what was repressed to nevertheless be traceable precisely through the distortions of the biblical text itself. So you might add what's sort of the value added of Paul's particular transmission. Although Freud provides no guidance here, I'm tempted to look to the famous 7th chapter of Paul's Epistle to the Romans, where he bemoans the sinfulness that is revived and inflamed by the prohibition. What interests me are the final 2 paragraphs of the passage on your handout. I'll put it up here. Wait, it's further along than that. Yeah, there we go. Did that which is good then bring death to me? We know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. I do not understand my own actions. For I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Now, if I do what I do not want, I agree that the law is good. So then, it is no longer I that do what I do not want. So then it is no longer I that do it, but sin, which dwells within me. For I know that nothing good dwells within me, that is, in my flesh. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. Now if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I that do it, but sin which dwells in me. So I find it to be a law that when I want to do right, evil lies close at hand. For I delight in the law of God in my inmost self, but I see in my members another law at war with the law of the mind, making me captive to the law of sin, which dwells in my members. Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then, I of myself serve the law of God with my mind, but with my flesh I serve the law of sin. So what strikes me here, and I'm not sure this is totally clear because I just wrote this afternoon, but what strikes me here is Paul's characterization of sin as something that dwells within the body, in the flesh, right? So in context, of course, he's referring to the sin of covetousness, right? The illicit desire for the neighbor's wife. Reading with Freud, however, we might understand this passage as referring not only to fleshly or carnal desires, but to something that is inscribed in the body, right? Something that dwells in its members. So note how he speaks of the agency of sin as a kind of unconscious agency, right? Something acting in my body that I don't understand, that I don't want, that I cannot control. Under the name of sin, therefore, Paul really discovers the unconscious itself, we might say, a force at work in the body, in the flesh, that pushes us to act in ways that are unmotivated and unwilled. Perhaps it is precisely this insight that expresses in distorted form Paul's knowledge that Moses was murdered by the Israelites, a knowledge that Freud stresses is entirely unconscious. But there is also a strange tension here. The law of sin at work in his members pushes Paul to do the thing he hates. This implies that the unwilled act is a source of horror for Paul, something he might wish to control in himself in order to better serve the law of God with his mind. In other words, we could understand him here as precisely kind of calling out for a better repression in some way, bemoaning the extent to which he is unable to bring the unconscious to heal, to make it serve his mind. Considered from this point of view, the problem with the law might be that it's not strong enough, not able to curb these unwelcome impulses. This interpretation is directly contradicted by the first part of the passage, however, where Paul claims that the very law that commands him not to sin, not to covet, actually gives opportunity to sin, which uses the commandment to deceive him. I should not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, you shall not covet. So I think what we can hear in these words is a kind of indictment of repression itself, right? Inasmuch as the effect of repression is to efface unconscious desire by offering up a substitute for it. In this sense, it not only criminalizes desire, but fundamentally falsifies the nature of desire by making it desire for this, desire for that, right? Desire for the neighbor's donkey, desire for the neighbor's wife, right? In other words, it directs desire to a specific object, binding it to an object that was never really wanted in the first place, right? In so doing, it also compromises desire itself, inasmuch as desire is never desire for, right? In other words, what is fundamental in human desire is the notion that it has no object, right? Desire is never desire for something that you could have. It's never desire for sex, desire to possess, right? Desire is without object and therefore unlimited, unextinguishable. In other words, Paul's key insight is that the subject of the act, can only be a criminal with respect to the law. Prior to his conversion, Paul was himself a zealous enforcer of the Jewish law, which he implied mercilessly to the members of the Jesus cult. Recall that the voice that waylays Paul on the road to Damascus is credited with the words, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" After this experience, he will no longer persecute Jesus with the Jewish law, with the threat of repression, you might say, but will declare his fidelity to this real in the form of a truth that is beyond the law. In other words, he reintroduces as essential the dimension of the real, and with it the act. So it's sort of Badiouian Paul, if you will, as much as it pains me to acknowledge that. Badiou will emerge from his conversion experience to launch his polemic against the written law, to which he opposes the living law of the Spirit. We generally think of Paul as displacing or even undermining the Mosaic legacy. Freud himself concludes that Paul, by developing the Jewish religion further, became its destroyer. But that destruction of the law can also be heard in another way as a liberation of the act. Right? So this is the first part of the passage. My brethren, you have died to the law through the body of Christ, so that you may belong to another, to him who has been raised from the dead, in order that we may bear fruit for God. While we were living in the flesh, our sinful passions aroused by the law were at work in our members to bear fruit for death. But now we are discharged from the law, dead to that which held us captive, so that we serve not under the old written code, but in the new life of the Spirit. So I think the question is, what is meant here by being discharged from the law? Right? Consider from the vantage point of the fantasy of expiation, which is what Freud emphasizes. We are discharged from the law might mean simply we no longer need to be dealt with as sinners because the crime has already been expiated in a certain sense, right? In other words, Christ has generously taken it upon himself to expiate the sins of man so that we are no longer guilty, right? The sort of wish fulfillment side of the equation. But I want to suggest that it could also be understood as a kind of liberation of the act itself, which is no longer bounded by the law, no longer bounded by speech or by the particular objects that it might propose to us. So that the solution in a way would be not to repress the act, but to allow it to find another means of expression, right? When the act is no longer bounded by the law, what then? What new life becomes possibility? So as counterintuitive as it may seem, I wonder now whether Paul's insight about the impossibility of fulfilling the law might be precisely what he receives from Moses. In this reading, Paul would represent not only the overturning or destruction of the Jewish tradition, but a certain development or continuation of the quest of Moses, that part that cannot be reconciled with the symbolic transmission. Like Moses, Paul encounters his God in the real, in the form of the voice that interpolates him on the road to Damascus, in a kind of repetition of Moses' own experience. There is something of the burning bush in this encounter, not least because it results in blinding, and so in the loss, however temporary, of the imaginary. St. Paul, as passeur, transmits something very different than Aaron the high priest. Slavoj Žižek has argued that the priest or priestess must be distinguished from the saint on the grounds that the former has a purely symbolic function, the latter a real function. Importantly, that real function engages the body itself in the form of the wound or stigmata the saint receives. I wonder whether it might be precisely the blindness of Paul, which is his wound, his letter, that transmits something of the real that passes through the testimony of Moses. If so, it might suggest that Paul is blinded not by what he sees on the road to Damascus, because after all, he sees nothing, he hears a voice, but by what Moses sees, the blinding fire of the burning bush, and thus the insistence of a real for which there is no name. I want to conclude by returning to the anger of Moses, whose significance for Freud is amplified by his other earlier text on Moses, a reflection on the sculpture of Moses that Michelangelo created to adorn the tomb of Pope Julius II. Okay. In Freud's analysis, the subject of this sculpture is precisely the anger of Moses. In and of itself, of course, this interpretation is hardly surprising. In fact, Freud shows that previous commentators of the work are virtually unanimous in viewing the sculpture as a representation of the moment when Moses, having turned his head to see his faithless people engaged in idolatry, is just about to spring to his feet in anger and shatter the tables of the law. Right? There's Charlton Heston showing us how it's done. This view cannot be reconciled with the way Michelangelo has sculpted the body of the prophet, however, which Freud shows to have been described incorrectly by almost every scholar of the work, precisely because they have allowed their perceptions of the statue to be unduly influenced by the text of the Bible. To the contrary, Freud stresses how thoroughly Michelangelo's depiction of Moses has departed from the biblical narrative. Instead of representing the moment before Moses smashes the tables in his rage, Freud claims that the sculpture shows us what he calls an apocryphal Moses, at the moment after he has overcome the urge to act upon his anger. Right. So to go, I mean, it's a really insane development because it takes about 20 pages, but what he essentially shows is that by studying the gestures of the statue, you can see that what happened is that initially you had Moses just sort of standing there, minding his own business with the two tablets neatly tucked under his arm. Then he hears the people worshiping the golden calf over here, and he starts up in horror, thereby entangling his beard in his fingers and pulling it across his body, right? And at this moment, the tables of the law, therefore, slip and are almost dropped, right? And so it's at the moment when he realizes that the tablets are going to fall and smash that he, in a sense, regains control, right? So he says, Michelangelo has placed a different Moses on the tomb of the Pope, one superior to the historical or traditional Moses. He has modified the theme of the broken tables. He does not let Moses break them in his wrath, but makes him be influenced by the danger that they will be broken, and makes him calm that wrath, or in any case prevent it from becoming an act. In this way, he has added something new and more human to the figure of Moses, so that giant frame with its tremendous physical power becomes only a concrete expression of the highest mental achievement that is possible in a man, that of struggling successfully against an inward passion for the sake of a cause to which he has devoted himself. Stephen Miller underscores that for Freud, Moses does not overcome his anger, on the contrary, but only the impulse to act upon it. Accordingly, it is this restraint, what Mallarmé calls action restreinte, that becomes the very matter of Michelangelo's sculpture, inseparable from its weight and physical stature, inseparable too from the decision to make this object the occasion for a sculpture rather than a painting or a poem. Freud describes how he himself was forced to modify his interpretation of the sculpture over the course of repeated visits to its site. I can recollect my own disillusionment when I used to sit down in front of the statue in the expectation that I should now see how it would start up on its raised foot, dash the tables of the law to the ground, and let fly its wrath. Nothing of the kind happened. Instead, the stone image became more and more transfixed. An almost oppressively solemn calm emanated from it, and I was obliged to recognize that something was represented here that could stay without change, that this Moses would remain like this in his wrath forever. This forever makes anger into a passion that is not reactive, but immanent and virtual, a wrath that will never be dissipated or spent. If this anger is the object of Moses, as I have suggested here, then it makes perfect sense that it would become the occasion for what Miller describes as a mute form. For sculpture, the art form for which Freud professes in this essay to have the greatest personal affinity, is concerned, perhaps more than any other, with the bodily transmission of the unsaid, of something that cannot be put into words. Indeed, Freud marvels at how often Michelangelo, in his sculpted creations, has gone to the utmost limit of what is expressible in art, precisely by refusing to subordinate the body to a narrative. What is remarkable about Freud's own analysis is the extent to which it is based solely upon the body, the sculpted body of Moses, but also the act that animates the body of Michelangelo himself as he carves its form. Maurice Blanchot, in a wonderful but little-known text, emphasizes the weariness of Moses, his extreme embodiment, which he finds to be encapsulated in the narrative of the Israelites' war with Amalek. He is shown to be faltering, a poor speaker, heavy of mouth, weary to the point of ruining his own health by the excessive services he does for others. He is weary, too, when Amalek wages war on the Hebrews, just when they had barely left slavery in Egypt and are a motley band, made up mainly of women and children. Moses is not a warrior chief. Yet he is positioned on the top of a hill, as is the case with generals. But he has to be helped when he gives out apparently simple instructions. He holds up his hand to point to the sky, and the Hebrews prevail. But precisely, his hands are heavy, and he has to be aided in order to carry out this gesture. Otherwise, his arm will fall to his side, and Amalek wins the day. In this evocation of the heavy hands of Moses and the aid provided by those who helped to hold them up, I am reminded of the procedure of the past with which I began. I prop up the object of the passant by putting my, or rather her, heavy head in my hands, just as Moses, in his founding act, props up the object of Akhenaten's desire. Finally, the act of Michelangelo's body in sculpting the marble allows us to see the object of Moses, his restrained anger, by transmitting something not relayed by the biblical text or by religious tradition. These acts of transmission would be impossible were it not for the aid provided by those who help to support, to bear, and to prop up the object that weighs the body down, hampers and oppresses it, but that also allows it to act in the world so that desire may prevail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tracy. So, as you know, we have plenty of time for questions, comments, and symptoms.
Just don't throw anything.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. That was really intriguing. I am wondering whether this thesis that you developed, particularly with regard to Romans, is capable of expansion. In light of the fact that one of the most serious tensions in the epistles is the tension between, treatment of law as something that is past, fulfilled, and abolished, and treatment of law as something that is still in some way ongoing. So you have this famous hesitation between, for instance, Ephesians, which suggests a very kind of Protestant approach to, where has the law gone, to something like the book of James, which suggests the law is persistent and inchoate within the very structures that are supposed to succeed it. So I was wondering if you might just talk about that kind of, fundamental and very schismatic tension as maybe manifesting some of this hesitation that you've discussed.
Right, yeah. Yeah, thank you, that's very helpful. I mean, I hadn't really thought about the epistles of Paul particularly until yesterday, actually, because we were reading the Moses Monotheism for my seminar, right? So I had initially been thinking primarily about the stigmata, right, the blindness, right, as a sort of a site of transmission. But I'm not sure how much sense that really makes, right? And one of the things that really intrigues me is, what does Freud see in Paul, right? Because I had always been tempted to read his assessment of Paul as primarily a critical one, right? So in a way, it's Paul who, in introducing the gospel of salvation, right? In a sense, with it sort of reintroduces the group psychology and totemism, right? So, he'll say, Paul, by taking the Jewish religion further, also destroyed it, right? But what he puts in its place is, in a sense, a renewed effort of the sons to once and for all annihilate the Father, right? So he says the religion of Jesus, as Paul understands it, will be a religion of brothers, right? And so the Father is sort of gotten rid of once and for all, right? So you can see him as, in a way, indicting Paul. Ooh, that was interesting. For affecting a sort of regression, right, with respect to what's at stake in the Mosaic Law, which is precisely the opening up of this space where one is not sort of confronted with a present authority with whom one identifies and so forth, right? But I think in another way, I'm sort of interested by the idea that you can see Paul not merely as overturning the Mosaic Law in what is most interesting about it, right? But actually in some way inheriting something from Moses, right? So I guess, in fact, what I haven't really made clear in this final section is that I think the question of what act is transmitted to Paul is sort of the fundamental question, right? Because on one level we can say that Paul, as a Jew, right, feels the guilt that all Jews feel in some way, right? He's one of the guilty, if you will, right? So it's his own guilt that is being expiated through the fantasy of salvation, right? But in another way, I think so in that sense that, he's the heir of the acting in place of remembering, right, that characterizes the initial murder of Moses, right? So it's that act that he carries on, including the non-acknowledgement of it, right? So that he, in essence, murders Moses all over again, right? But in another way, and this is something that I've sort of gradually been led to in thinking about this, because, I'm very much a kind of proponent of law from a certain point of view, although this is something I'm trying to overcome in myself. I'm interested in the way in which Freud's reading of Moses actually does not emphasize the law at all. I mean, I actually only noticed that for the first time like a couple of weeks ago, that he never mentions the Decalogue, right? This is not really part of the Mosaic transmission for him, right? Instead, it really is sort of the desire of Moses, right, as it's manifested in this founding project that is central for him, right? So he'll say, what Moses introduces is spirituality and sublimation, which you can certainly understand is what the Decalogue is all about, right? And there's a very rich Jewish tradition around precisely that problem. But I don't think that Freud is particularly relating that to the Decalogue, right? In other words, he speaks a little bit about the second commandment, right, the ban against images and sort of what this represents. But I don't think it's the Mosaic Law as institution that he's particularly upholding. Neither is he critical of it, I would say, right? But it's not really what he's emphasizing in that reading of Moses. So I'm sort of interested in the idea that, Paul is not only remembering by repeating, but in a sense, there's something of Moses which was repressed by that tradition that he's also carrying on. You see what I mean? So what that means in terms of a reading of the Gospels, I think I still have to think through. But I think what you said about the notion of the law as sort of passed down as something already settled in some way, versus the idea that it's still ongoing, right? It suggests a more active and sort of responsible relation to the law. And this is specifically a Jewish reading, I think, in some way, right? The law is not just something you obey, right? The law is an instrument, right, that you have to work with yourself to determine what to do, right? It's not a matter of sort of slavishly obeying something. But I think I'm trying to have a slightly more positive view of the law of the heart, right, in Paul, which is always something that I had sort of been dismissive of, and thinking about how this might be, one way of thinking about sort of desire itself in the terms in which I'm putting it here. It's another feeling the weight of recapitulating 3,000 years there.
That was great. It gives a lot to think and to think through. I was wondering, since you made reference reluctantly, and I'm curious why, but that's not the question really, to Badiou and his, let's say, philosophical reading of Paul, whether you had any thoughts on another reading who, in addition to Agamben's and Badiou's, has made some splash in quite philosophical terms as well, namely Jacob Taubes's.
Right.
Because although I forget the details, but I seem to recall that Taubes makes a case for Freud identifying himself first of all with Paul, with a certain Paul, of course. So that's quite explicit, if I'm not mistaken, in the political theology of Paul. So that's whether that could be. I suspect that could be a useful element in the archive that you have assembled, even though Taubes's reading is in many respects also very problematic, provocative, idiosyncratic, as it were. And then, relatedly, maybe, because this is how I take Taubes to suggest the philosophical reading of Paul. This is what messianic temporality means. Could one not say that some of the things that you are teasing out in psychoanalytic terms, in the Freudian and Lacanian register, but especially the relationship between the untreatable and, let's say, treatment, or between the objet, petit a, and the real and the symbolic, etc. That is somehow prefigured, anticipated, or formalized in different terms, precisely in what Paul calls, let's say, the regime of the law and the life in the spirit. And then the question becomes, well, these are different poles, so to speak, of the analysis here, of Paul's analysis in these letters. But what is interesting is that he comes up with a certain relation as to what it might mean. And it's not one of supersession, pure and simple. But it's one of somehow co-inhabiting two registers, as it were. So that Paul is not, doing away with the law, just as he is not doing away by fiat with the world as we find it.
Right.
But being in that world, and in all its logos and law-imposed regularities and normativities, we are at the same time no longer held by it. We're in the world but not of it, and that's what to live in the spirit somehow means.
Yeah.
Without any illusion that we would be so far as to already live in and of the spirit alone. That's just not in the cards as long as history takes its course.
Yeah, I mean, thank you very much. I hadn't thought about Taubes recently. I worked on that material maybe 10 years ago. But thanks for the tip, and I'll definitely go back and look for that reading of Paul in particular. You mentioned sort of at the beginning the Badiou part, and what was at stake in that. I mean, I've actually written a whole number of, critical pieces on Badiou that take up different parts of this problem. But, you could say in a certain sense that Badiou's position is sort of explicitly a, it's a position which embraces the dimension of the fraternity, right, as patricidal in some way, right? So what Badiou affirms as the militant brotherhood, right, is explicitly based upon this dimension of Paul's discourse, right? And because Badiou is, of course, a reader of Freud, I think he's meaning to evoke that in very explicit terms, right? So part of what I find very problematic in his work, is the affirmation of the universal, right, and the way in which this is justified in relation to Paul, right? It's an argument specifically about Paul. I think it's an interesting argument, right? And the book on St. Paul, I think, is one of his better books. But we know what happens when you affirm universalism in the context of contemporary France, right? So to affirm the universal is also to wage war on any kind of communitarian identity, right? And one of the communitarian identities he's been most critical of is the Jew, right? So sort of the sacralization of the name Jew, in a certain kind of French philosophical discourse, right? But he's also an opponent of gay marriage, right? He's also an opponent of any kind of recognition of Islam, right? So all of these things that are kind of the baggage drawn along with that particular understanding of the universal are, I think, articulated by him in relation to Pauline theology in a way that's very sort of unexamined, right? And I think precisely the stakes of the polemic against the law in that tradition are something that he has not really taken up, right? But if you think about, another side of his work, declaring fidelity to an event, right? That in a sense is not an object of direct perception, right? The event is not something that I experience firsthand. It's not something I read about in the news, right? But it's something whose traces, I'm somehow struck by, right? And that I have to declare my fidelity to this event. I think that's actually extremely interesting for thinking about the act in the way that I'm trying to do it here, right? So I'm interested in going back to that side of his thought, and sort of giving it a second look. But I think everything that you said about the sort of complexity of Paul's position, in fact, that it's not one or the other, right? That it's in a sense working the distance between these two things. That seems extremely rich to me, right? And I'm also interested in the way in which a certain kind of Pauline discourse has been taken up in particular by Marx. So say like on the Jewish question, right? The way in which he wants to affirm love, right, as the basis for a communal understanding of man in relation to man, right, as opposed to man as separate from man, right? So there's a very rich kind of Marxist tradition of Paul, right, which I think Marx sort of belongs to there, even though it's interesting he doesn't ever mention Paul, right? I mean, he sort of ascribes that to Jesus. So I don't know if that constitutes a kind of an answer to what you're asking there.
Thank you. That was amazing. I have a sort of more contemporary situated question, which is just, I know that no one wants to talk about current politics, but nevertheless, there's been a real, resurgence right now in civility discourse. And I was thinking about what you said in terms of talking about the true actor as a lawbreaker and the illegality of the act as needing to transcend or at least upset the law in some way. I just wanted to know if you wanted to say something more about what concept of the act civility discourse or concept against the act civility discourse might be enacting or sort of calling upon in order to suppress political action or outcry. What sort of like illegality of discontent is there in contemporary politics, and how close to the sort of anarcho-vitalist idea that we could just get rid of regimes of law altogether in order to set us free, does that, understanding sort of bring us to?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really great question. I completely agree with you in the critique of the civility discourse, So I think, one thing that you see very much with the Democratic Party in particular today, right, is this kind of strategic calculation, right, about what is going to fly, right, as opposed to the articulation of a position that is necessary in some way, right? So I think the question of the act is sort of refusing all compromise, right? And this is precisely being what is affirmed in an ethics of psychoanalysis. I think this is very important, right? And this goes to a core of a kind of a popular misunderstanding, I think, of what psychoanalysis seeks to produce, right? Which is precisely, not someone who just sort of accepts, we all have to give up fundamental things in order to get along, this sort of idea. No, to the contrary, desire is what should never be the object of a concession, right? So if we think of desire not simply as sort of what I want, right, but as being concerned in some way with the human quest, right, with the status of the human itself. I mean, this is what my piece for Thursday will deal a little bit more with, right? Then I think that's also something we can think about in relation to a variety of political discourses that, as you know, I'm really interested in, including Rousseau on the general will, right? Because I think that's sort of precisely the problem that Rousseau raises there, is that the general will is not just what is opposed to my private will in the sense of this kind of imposed order that I have to accept and, assimilate myself to. Rather, the general will expresses in a way desire, in as much as desire relates to the emancipation of humanity, right? And not simply to the advancement of my own aims.
I have a question that's more methodological. In terms of what do you see as the role that translation or indeed mistranslation would play, especially in terms of the Old Testament, using that as a way of extrapolating something about the human psyche? Would you say that that's something that concerns you, or that mistranslations are themselves deliberate in some way?
Well, can you say a little bit more about what you're thinking about in terms of mistranslations?
I tried to think of a few that sprung to mind before I asked this question, but it's more that my understanding is that there is still an ongoing study in terms of how specific words have been mistranslated over the years that can give very different meanings in terms of how we interpret stories today. I mean, one that I think I've recently heard is that in the story of Adam giving his rib up, and that's what has been given to Eve, that itself being actually a penis, or something like that. Would you say things like this can alter the way that you are reading and interpreting these texts, or is it more important that the stories have remained the same, that they've endured?
I'm just imagining how that would change world history if he had actually given his penis to Eve. It definitely really results in an interesting thought experiment. I don't know. I'm not sure that I can comment specifically on translation with regard to this particular project. I mean, Freud, if you're familiar with his work, the question that he really takes up is the distortions and transpositions of the biblical text, right? So there's a famous line where he says, the distortion of a text is not unlike a murder, right? The difficulty is not in getting away with the deed, but in covering up the traces, right? So there's a level at which nothing can actually be repressed in the sense of completely gotten rid of, right? Something is repressed insofar as it is represented in another form, right? So the German Verdrängung literally means distortion, right? So repression implies the distortion, the transposition, the moving from here to there, right? So I think all of those archaeological metaphors that you find in Freud are related to that, right? There are these different pieces, they may have been sort of thrown over here, but they're not fundamentally destroyed, right? So there's a work of rearrangement, right? So that's really what he's interested in, right? So, the way in which particular terms or episodes are translated can, of course, be part of that, right? So there can be something sort of homogenizing about those translations. But I think the more fundamental question that comes in is the sort of constitution of the biblical text itself, right, out of all of its different source materials, right, and the way in which those texts were increasingly codified and then revised to highlight or exclude certain things.
Can I ask you a question about the past?
Yeah. I can't believe you, of all people, are going to ask me about it.
How that story turned out. I mean, did the physical symptoms produced in the two passeurs, did the jury take that as evidence that the passant was ready to be an analyst or not?
Yeah. That's a really good question because something that I didn't say in that part was I don't know what the people in the cartel of the past actually thought about that transmission, right? So I had this experience of kind of confirming or actually recognizing my experience in what happened to this other person, right? But it's entirely possible that they saw different things, right? Things that I was not aware of, or even other things that were shared between us that we were not aware of, right? So in a sense, there's no moment of sort of coming together and sharing the story, which is sort of interesting, right? But I guess that's how I understand it myself. So, in a sense, I can't really convey, how upset and disappointed I was by this testimony when I heard it. It was just really subpar, I thought, right? And so my overall impression was that really nothing had been transmitted at all, right? And that I had wasted a week of my time, like, hearing this nonsense. It was just nothing different than you would tell someone on the bus, So I guess what was profound for me was realizing the extent to which something actually had been transmitted, and I think in particular by this moment of sort of holding my head, right? So whether or not that was what struck others, it was something very undeniable for me, right? That retroactively I could see that being the cause of this whole series of symptoms, right? So that would suggest to me, and part of what's interesting about this person is that she is actually a psychoanalyst, right? Well, she was already a psychoanalyst, let's say. So this is an older person who's been working for a while. But to hear the nature of the testimony, your natural reaction would be to be perhaps alarmed that such a person was in charge of clinical cases, right, in terms of their way of speaking, right? So I guess for me, that was something that was very persuasive, right? Was actually seeing that there was a kind of an agency in this person that I too was affected by, and therefore, by implication, seeing that must be the case with their patients as well. Yeah.
So I wonder if I can ask for some clarification. You began the talk talking about transmission of the act. You said very early on this is something that was intersubjective. You have at least three examples in the talk. And the first one, it seems clear to me, is intersubjective transmission between the passant and you being passed through it. This is, in some respects, a kind of spatial transmission. Your third example becomes an example of the exchange between Moses and Paul, which becomes intersubjectively through time. But I think I'm at a bit of a loss for what the transmission is in the second example, which is between Freud. Because it seems that the relationship here is between Freud and his dream. And if this is the case, then I wonder what we mean by intersubjective. I wonder what the nature of that relationship is. And I wonder if it is an example that fits with the other two.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm sure at a certain level, the examples are heterogeneous, right? I mean, there's slightly different things at stake in each one. But I think the second example is actually the most important example, right? Because it explains in some way how psychoanalysis works, right? And in a way that I think is very unacceptable, right, for most people, but is something that needs to be affirmed, right? So the idea that, Freud is subject to tremendous countertransferences, right, in particular in dealing with his early patients, right, this is well remarked upon. But it tends to be a reason to dismiss that work, right? So here we see Freud simply imposing his interpretations, right? Here we see him comporting himself in this incredibly violent way, right? So, I mean, if you know his case histories, one of my favorite early cases is the one of Elizabeth von R, right, who suffers from these paralyzing leg pains. And Freud, rather than helping to relieve the suffering associated with the legs, actually injects her with electric shocks, right, so as to increase the pain so that she will have further associations with it, right? So there's something, I think, not incorrectly perceived as kind of sadistic about analysis, right? In the sense that the point is not to relieve the suffering associated with the symptom, which can sometimes be very, very significant, right? But rather to treat the symptom as a guide, right? So the symptom is really, the rabbit hole, in a sense, right? And you have to go down it. That's just how it is, right? But I think if someone knew that before doing analysis, they might not do it, right? So there's a side, and it's an interesting part of being an analyst, right? Is knowing that that's what you're about to do to someone, right? And that's unavoidable. And I think that this is why Freud makes a requirement of analysis, having gone through analysis yourself, right? I mean, you have to know, in a sense, through personal experience, that is indispensable, that you can't get around it, right? Because otherwise it would be very hard to do it to another person, right? So, I mean, the point that I wanted to make about the dream was you're absolutely right to say it's Freud's dream, right? It's not Irma's dream, right? So in some sense it doesn't tell us anything about Irma's own experience. But I think the question is, Freud is sort of wondering, have I mistreated the patient, right? Am I responsible for the fact that her symptoms are continuing? And what the dream shows him is that his own object, right, his own symptoms, are in the body of his patient, right? So yes, you could say on one level it's Freud's, he's the dreamer, so obviously the dream is about him and his own symptoms, right? But I'm talking about this as the agency of his own object within the body of that patient. So if she's continuing to have symptoms, you could say it's not only because the treatment has failed, right, or because he has dismissed her in some way, even if that's also true. If she's continuing to have symptoms, it's because that's actually the transference, right? So one of the interesting things about this dream, I only talked about sort of a tiny fragment of it, but one of the interesting things about it is that the analysis ends up, in a way, confirming Freud in his hypothesis that the dream has a sexual etiology, right? So he goes to sleep, in a sense, full of self-doubt, right? I mean, does he actually know what he's doing, right? Is he on to something? Or is he just, sort of continuing the horrible suffering of these people? And the dream, through the signifier of trimethylamine, actually, will lead to a whole series of associations relating to the sexual etiology of hysteria. So in this sense, the dream also upholds the desire of Freud, you could say, and says, in a way, keep going. Sort of keep up the tension. Yeah.
Thank you. Just one quick thing and then another other thing, which is, I was so interested in the point about the kind of impossibility of using these scientific methods of verification. And so then I did also have a question about the past, because in a way, is it true that they have to kind of see the same response in the two witnesses in order, right? So there is a kind of repeatability or verifiability in that process. So that seemed like an interesting
Right, exactly, yeah. Yeah, and this is of course very debatable, right? But I want to kind of, push the claim a little bit that one can see this as a kind of falsifiability, right? Not for someone external to that experience, obviously, right? Like I'm sure that no one here was even remotely convinced by what I said, and I don't see how it could be persuasive outside of this kind of experience, right? I mean, that would be ridiculous. You would just be putting your faith in a kind of testimony, right? And yet I think for the one who goes through it, right? There is an experience of confirmation that's very powerful, right? And when I had this experience, it was just when I was finishing my own analysis. And this experience had a lot to do with the end of my analysis, actually, of like, okay, now I'm ready to end, you know? So that there's a kind of scientific dimension to it, you might say, right? Even if it's not the scientificity of the scientific method, which seeks to exclude the subjectivity of the participant. It really depends upon it in a certain way.
Okay, thanks. And then, you know, I love the reading of Irma's Dream. It did lead me to another sort of current events question, though, because going through my mind was toxic masculinity, which is kind of literalized there. So, you know, about your attraction to the law, but also commitment to desire, something we've all been thinking about a lot lately, I guess. You know, because kind of when you got to the reading of the Michelangelo passage, that, you know, he hasn't given up on his anger, but he's not acting on it necessarily. I was like, that seems kind of good to me right now. Like, I'm into that idea. But I didn't know if you were.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So is that,
yeah.
I mean, because that would be like the kind of the way I would sort of resolve that commitment to
Right.
to the symptom and to desire without just being committed to just do whatever the hell you want to.
Right, of course. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you know, certainly psychoanalysis implies a, you know, very radical sense of personal responsibility, right? So it's not just sort of, this is who you are, you know, let it all hang out or something, right? It's not this sort of, you know, Woody Allen idea.
Could kind of sound like that or whatever, I guess.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so that's, I mean, I just want to hear more about how you think about
Right, I think that's precisely the point is, you know, if the act is coming from you, then you alone are responsible for it and for its effects on other people, right? So in a sense, to be just in the kind of acting in place of remembering, right, is also to be just cutting a wide swath of destruction through the world, right, without, in a sense, seeing that you're responsible for it, right? So the taking responsibility certainly implies doing something about what that means for a collective, right? So I think to the extent that psychoanalysis has a value for thinking about politics, it's kind of from that point of view as well. Yeah. I like the idea of Freud as toxic masculinity, though. I'm going to have to use it. Yeah.
Can I ask a question that tries to put together just a few remarks that were made by the questioners, which struck me as really interesting? So, and talking about the co-inhabiting of different registers, Jonathan Culler's introduction, which pointed us to your work on hospitality, but also your throwaway line that you're kind of in awe of the law and are trying to get over that.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I'd be interested in hearing you talk a little bit more about how all of these projects fit together and what the payoff is for you as critic. So I guess what strikes me, or what I find very interesting is, and this takes us back, I guess, to the past, your description of the past. So what struck me in your description of it was the very, the extraordinary termination of that process in terms of legal description, right? So we've got testimony, you've got witnesses, you've got a jury. This isn't tremendously clear, I'm sorry, there are lots of little things floating around here, but what I'm interested in, I think, is the similarity of the kind of pieces of text which you presented as having various kinds of evidentiary qualities. And what came into my mind was a description that Mark Sanders offers in his book on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, called Ambiguities of Witnessing, where he talks about the similarities between fiction and the moment in a courtroom where testimony is not held up to verifiability. Right? So there's something about that moment in which it is not yet accounted for as true or false. I'm not sure I can tie that all up into a question, but I'm interested in those processes, and in particular in what those texts are, or what they're offering you as critics. So allegory? Are they all, are the energies metonymic or metaphoric? So if you could try and tie some of those together and tell us a bit about what the payoff is for you as a critic.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Everything that you said about testimony, witnessing, jury, the evidentiary, I mean, I think that's extremely rich, and I definitely want to think about that more. Thank you. I hadn't actually been aware of that kind of trial language, oddly enough, when I was presenting it. I mean, I think in relation to your last point about South Africa, right, and the idea of the testimony not being held to a kind of veracity, right? I mean, I think that is clearly central to any notion of psychoanalytic testimony, right? Including just in a single session, right? In that what the analysand testifies to, if you will, in their experience is always going to be something completely unknown for the analyst, right? I mean, so this is why diagnosis, if you will, can't just sort of come in place of listening to the signifiers coming from the subject, right? To say, like, this one's a neurotic, this one's a pervert, right? That in a way is a shutting down of the singularity of a subject's speech, right? And I guess, part of what I want to highlight in the past, I mean, I hope that it came through that I'm not only saying I did a good job, although in a way I do sort of seem to be saying that at the end, but also saying that I failed in that, right? And maybe that failure is unavoidable to some extent, right? In other words, like in the affect of irritation, right, in my sense of sort of the impoverishment of this discourse, right, that there was nothing there I hadn't heard before in a certain way, right? That was precisely a way of not hearing what was being said, right? And I think that's always a danger, right, in an analytic situation, is that there's something about a subject's speech which is very unmanageable, right? It's just sort of a wall of language kind of coming at you, right? And I think to defend against that in its particularity, right, is a natural reaction, but one that an analyst has to fight against, right? So I guess that defensive posture is what is sort of evoked for me in that, right? And the possibility that one might just sit in judgment, right, to go back to sort of the trial metaphor, right, as opposed to it being a question of testimony. I mean, in terms of like how all of the projects fit together, they do, yes, I think. It wouldn't be maybe easy to evoke that. I mean, I guess I would have to say that what is shared by all of the different things that I'm working on, except the recent thing that Jonathan mentioned on perversion and speculative philosophy, but everything else is concerned in a fairly central way with femininity. And I think this is what drew me to psychoanalysis in the first place, was what it had to offer to me as a woman, you could say, but what it has to offer in the way of an understanding of what is at stake in femininity and its place in culture in some way. So in the book that is in some way an affirmative reading of the symbolic, which is sort of bizarre, if you know what the symbolic is, that's part of the point that I wanted to make there, is that it's easy to sort of denigrate the symbolic by saying, oh, these old institutions, right? And I think that's obviously an important criticism. But to say if we collapse the symbolic to being simply a normative set of practices, for example, then we miss what is ultimately at stake there, which is some sense of, what is useful about the signifier, what is useful about language, right, when it comes to dealing with the subject of the drive, right? So yes, language is repression. Language proposes a representation in the place of something that can't be represented. But the talking cure, like every form of therapy, right, also involves some notion that to speak, right, is to be relieved of something that acts in you without your knowing about it, right? So part of what I wanted to bring to that was, in a sense, you could say in Freud, you have studies in hysteria at the beginning, and then at the very end you have Moses and monotheism. And I think there are a lot of ways in which you could see those two works as doing the same thing in some respects, right? So I think one of the interesting questions that he takes up with hysteria, and according to Lacan kind of drops along the way, is some sense of what does the hysteric's experience reveal about what language is, right? What kind of function it serves for a woman in her relation to the drive, right? So if culture proposes all kinds of prohibitions for men, right, say the incest prohibition, the Oedipus complex, and so forth, there's nothing equivalent on the side of women, right? There's no law, there's no prohibition which is specifically addressed to women, you could say. So what does that sort of reveal about the impossibility of repressing femininity on the one hand, right? So that's what the hysteric attests to. But at the same time, the need of the hysteric for something equivalent, you could say, right? She too has a need to have some way of working with the drive. And I think that's what psychoanalysis provides. So Michel Montreuil actually is a Lacanian theorist who I particularly like from the 1970s. Right, she offers that the contribution of psychoanalysis was actually to repress femininity, right? But she means this in an affirmative way, right? In the sense of like providing some possibility for that experience to be evoked in language, and therefore not simply to be expressed by means of symptoms. So I think it's part of that sort of more enabling side, if you will, of the signifier that I was trying to bring to bear to look at these other more conventional ways of thinking about the symbolic, in terms of law, in terms of juridical practice, and so forth.
I think that summary provides a good stopping point. We can continue discussion over maybe up at the 80 White House. There's a reception to which you are all invited. Thanks.
Thank you.